Hello again and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing a super simple sunshiny linen shirt tutorial. That was a lot of S's. This is just a super quick and easy peasant-y kind of summery top that I will be walking you through how to make. This tutorial is super beginner friendly with really easy pieces that should be pretty quick and simple to put together. It only took me a few hours total, so great afternoon project. If you like this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe down below if you'd like to see more tutorials from me, and let me know what kind of stuff you've been wanting to make for the summer. It's getting pretty hot here, so I'm very excited to put it to good use. All right, let's jump into it. So for the supplies, you will need about 1.5 yards of your chosen fabric. I'm using this nice linen. Depending on how your pattern pieces turn out, you might need more. Matching thread, as well as elastic. I'm using 1/4 inch, but any skinny elastic will work. And then of course we'll need our typical scissors, measuring tape, pins. I'm using a water-soluble marker to mark where I need to cut, but any marking tool will work. As well as this clear ruler to help me mark my patterns. First thing we need to do is take measurements. The first one will be around your shoulders where you want the shirt to sit. This was kind of a pain to do by myself, and I made sure it still slid around comfortably, and I got 43. If you have someone to help you, this process will be a lot easier. The next measurement I needed to do was from my armpit to my armpit. Again, I did it a little lower than I wanted it to sit, just so I had some extra room, and I got 14. And then I did the same on the back, and I got like 14.5. And then finally that I recorded, I needed to do from where I wanted it to sit down to my natural waistline, which is originally how long I wanted it to be. Alrighty, so now that we have those measurements, I have mapped out all of my pieces. They are not to scale. Please don't assume that they are. So the first piece and the widest piece is going to be the ruffle, which I'm going to cut 2 off of, so there will be seams at the sides of my arms. That first measurement that we took, plus seam allowance. And since there's going to be 2 of them, once we put the elastic in, it will cinch back down around my arms while still giving me plenty of room for movement and a nice little ruffle, obviously. So for the front and the back pieces, they're both going to be squares, and we are also going to make these twice as wide as our measurement. So 14 times 2 plus seam allowance for the front, for my front, and 14.5 times 2 plus seam allowance for that back piece. Once again, that will allow it to cinch nicely. And I realized that my math for that was wrong, so we're ignoring it. So for the underarm pieces, where I took my overbust, which I forgot to film, but basically that is directly under your armpits, around your entire torso. So basically this for the first measurement we took, but without the arms, with that extra width. So I took that overbust measurement, subtracted 14 for the front piece, subtracted 15.5 for the back piece, and got 6.5. And that is the extra space that we need to make up the circumference of the shirt. And since there's going to be one of these on either side, I divided by 2, getting myself 3.25, which took longer than I would like to admit because I'm bad at math. This piece is going to be 3.25 plus seam allowance. For the height, we're going to take that last measurement we took, which was where we wanted the shirt to sit, to our natural waistline, or wherever you want the bottom of the shirt to sit. And then I added 3 inches, so it'll be a nice little ruffle, as well as seam allowance. And so that's the height for the front, the back, and the underarm. And this ruffle is also going to be 3 inches tall, plus seam allowance, just to keep it even. Okay, I hope that made sense. Feel free to leave me questions if it didn't. And now we can cut it out. Since I have linen, I am just marking where I want to cut, and then I'm using the thread pulling method to ensure that my lines are really super straight, because linen is prone to shifting. But if you have an easier fabric, like a cotton but if you have an easier fabric that doesn't shift as much, like a cotton or even some polyesters, you might not need to do this, in which case you can just draw a line that you need to cut across. And I did this for all of my pieces, including the ruffles, the front, the back, and the side pieces, which I will show you in a moment. Okay, so I've cut out my two side pieces here, and for now I'm going to leave the scoops out so that I can have an easier time sewing on the edges to the front and back edges without having to worry about getting the seam allowance exact. And once those are sewn on, I can much more easily cut out where my arm needs to go without worrying about cutting it too close to the edge. After all those were cut, everything got a nice iron so that it was looking nice and pretty and ready to be sewn. And then I pinned all of my pieces together. As I will explain in the moment, I am pinning them right sides outwards so that we can do a French seam, but since the linen does not really have a right side, that was not a huge concern. Alrighty, so now all of my pieces are cut out and pinned. I have my side pieces inserted, both of them, into the sides of my front and back pieces. I do have my front piece marked with a pin just so I can keep them straight, as well as my ruffle. My ruffle, I just attached the two edges, making sure that it's not at all twisted in any way. So since we're doing a French seam for this, you have to make sure that instead of doing wrong sides together like you normally do, you have to put the right sides together. Since I'm using linen, that doesn't really apply here, so it's really hard to see, and I apologize about that. But if you have any sort of pattern or any sort of fabric that has a very clear right and wrong side, make sure your right sides are facing outwards, so the wrong sides are together. And you will see why that is in a minute. So after those French seams are done, we're going to finish off the bottom edge of the ruffle and the bottom edge of the shirt part. So then I just stitched them all together. I'm using a pretty small seam allowance, using the edge of the foot as my allowance and my line that I am following. You can also do a little smaller if you're comfortable with that, but this is going to be trimmed and then folded inwards, so smaller the better. And here I am trimming really close to that stitch line, making sure not to cut through it. It's kind of hard to see because I matched my thread a little too well to my linen, but I'm just trimming it so that the excess does not get in the way of our French seam. Now for the next step of the French seam, I am ironing down the seam allowance to one side. It doesn't really matter which side, but this will just help your seams end up nice and clean. And then I'm turning it over and just pressing it once again to make sure that it's nice and neat. After I do this, I then fold it so that that's stitch line exactly in the fold and iron that flat. Then we're going to stitch just away from that edge, the same way you would do a normal seam, which will encase those raw edges within a little pocket. Here's how it looks when it's all ironed. And I did that with all of my pieces. And then here I'm doing a little bit of a bigger seam allowance. I like to go really small generally, so a bigger seam allowance is basically just not using the machine foot as the edge. So I'm just using one line over. I'm not sure what that measurement is, because I never do that properly. But I'm just doing it so that I know that the raw edges will not be caught in my stitches. And then that all gets a nice iron. And here is how our French seams look all nice and finished. Now we can hem the bottom of the shirt as well as the ruffle, and to do this I am just turning up the edge once using the selvage as my guide for how thick I want that to be. And then turning that up once more so those raw edges are encased. You won't be able to see this, but I also added a few pins to hold this hem in place, just so it didn't shift around while I was sewing. And then for the ruffle, I did exactly the same thing, but with a much narrower hem. And then I just stitched that down. I'm getting as close to that edge as possible without going over, trying to make it look nice and neat and ensuring that everything lies nice and flat. Now that that is done, we can now cut our armholes. I just did a little dip. I just kind of guesstimated how much I wanted it to go down and then folded it in half to use it for a pattern to make sure that it was symmetrical. I ended up having to go back to make this open a little more because it was kind of digging into my armpits, but whatever guesstimation you come across will work. Now we're making our elastic channels. I'm doing this the same way that I did the hem, which is just turning it inwards twice, making sure that it is wide enough that the elastic can comfortably fit through. I ended up making them a little wider than I needed because I'd rather be safe than sorry, and I have struggled to pull elastic through a channel in the past, so I didn't want to risk it. So I marked the center front and center back of my ruffle, as well as my front and back pieces, so that I could line them up to make sure that it's all laid exactly where I wanted it to. And then I just pinned that in place to ensure that it wasn't shifting. And then I tuck the raw edge of the shirt into this hem that we make with the ruffle. And then once we stitch that down, it will both attach the ruffle to the shirt and finish off that top edge. And because the side pieces are sloped down and away from the top, they will not be caught, and we can finish those independently and use our ruffles as little armholes. And so here is that side piece showing how it's not getting caught and how it just ends right there. I am making sure that while I'm doing this, that my seam allowances are in towards the front and the back and not overhanging the side pieces, because it'll be visible if that happens, and that is not what I want. So there's my armhole, and see how it does not attach. And I can stick my hand right through. Perfect. And then that just gets stitched down just like if it were a hem, and I'm doing it as close to the edge. Make sure that I'm giving the elastic as much room as possible. When you get to the end of this stitch line, make sure that you leave about an inch open gap so that you can have a place that the elastic can enter and exit through. Otherwise, you're going to be picking apart those seams and it will not be pleasant. Once that is done, here's my little opening so that my elastic can slip in there. For my elastic, I just simply stretched it around myself, which I struggled a bit with, and cut it where it was sat comfortably and snugly, but not so much that it was cutting off my circulation or anything. And I made sure to add a little seam allowance and chop it off right there. Now I'm using 2 safety pins to insert this elastic. The first one is going through one end of the elastic, and this will be used so I can guide it through the channel. And then the other one is being used to hold the elastic to the fabric, and this will make sure that end doesn't get sucked into the channel and lost as I am threading it through. And then this is kind of just a messy process. You just kind of feel where the safety pin is and are pushing it through. Once you get to the end, you can pull out that last little tail from your little hole, and then we're going to stitch the 2 ends together. Instead of doing it like a seam, I like to lay them flat on top of each other and go over them. Even though this doesn't provide any extra stability or anything, it helps the elastic lay flatter and you don't get like a little bump within your channel. I'm just doing a straight stitch back and forth over the elastic. I'm doing it a bunch of times to make sure it's super secure and does not want to pull apart. And then after that's done, I stretch it out so it's flat, and I am stitching over that hole that we made, just closing it up, and I'm making sure that I'm getting as close to the edge as possible and not catching any of the elastic in these stitches. And then finally, we are finishing off those armholes, and I'm just doing what is called a rolled hem edge. And this basically, you just roll the fabric between your fingers. This doesn't work for all fabrics. You can also use bias tape if that is your preferred method. You just roll the fabric and that raw edge gets tucked away, and then I'm stitching it down with a simple whip stitch. And then it's done. Alright, that is it for me. I'm very happy with how this turned out. Right now the linen is a little stiff and it's kind of sticking out at a funny angle around my arms, but with a few more washes it will soften up and be perfect. If you liked this video, please make sure to give it a like and subscribe down below, and I hope you all are having a great summer. Okay, bye!